It all started with a sheet of paper that was stored in a drawer for almost 30 years. The man who finally got her out was not William. It wasn't Charles either. He was the man Camilla was married to before all this existed. Before the royal wedding, before the title, before the crown even came close to her. Andrew Parker Bowles requested a private meeting with the king, placed a paper on the table between them, and returned to the field that afternoon. 6 weeks later, Prince William signed a single page of administrative documents, and at 9 the next morning, the palace was silent. The kind of silence that occurs when a room suddenly gets cold, and no one wants to say out loud what has changed. Before moving on, a few words about how this is being built. I spend my time investigating everything that involves this family. Archives, household records, stories buried before anyone finished asking the second question. I spent the last 2 weeks in this. In the end, you will know exactly what William gave his name to, who gave him the reason, and why Camilla's future stopped belonging to him on a random Tuesday morning. The first sign came in the form of a memo. A page has been circulated through the internal mail system, the kind of document that normally gets just a quick glance, gets filed away, and no one gives it another thought. The employees who read this, however, did something different. They didn't archive it. They read it twice. Some read it a third time. Then they looked at each other with the expression of someone who understood that something permanent had happened and that no one was going to explain it. The memorandum covered Queen Camilla's household finances, your travel budget, your staff allocations, your personal expense accounts, the entire administrative machinery that allows a queen's cabinet to function like an office rather than that of a woman with an agenda and good intentions. All of this had been suspended, effective immediately, pending what the page called an expense review. No deadline, no context, no explanation of any kind. The name on the authorization line at the bottom did not belong to Camilla. It didn't belong to Charles either. It said, "The Office of the Prince of Wales." William had signed it personally. An expense review is not an investigation. It has no legal weight and does not contain any accusation. In real terms, it means someone wants to look at the accounts. But inside a palace where no one except the sovereign himself had ever interfered in a queen consort's financial arrangements, that small, boring word fell with the weight of a closing door. At 9 that morning, the halls entered the particular silence that palaces produce when something serious has happened and no one is allowed to talk about it. Employees moved more carefully than usual. Conversations became shorter. The superficial rhythm of the morning continued. The carts, the diaries, the polite good mornings. And underneath it all, something else was moving at a different speed. An absence made this silence louder than anything else could. Camilla wasn't there. She had a routine appointment on her calendar that morning. A short visit to a charitable organization she had supported for years. The kind of discreet appearance that generates 2 photographs and a paragraph. Someone canceled, didn't postpone, didn't move it to another week, with excuses. She canceled, without public notice and without explanation, to the organization that was waiting for her. The door to her office, which on any other morning would have been open at 8 o'clock, remained closed. His private secretary arrived, checked the hallway, and left without entering. A member of the domestic staff went upstairs to collect her morning mail and found the tray outside untouched. She always collected it herself, always. In 20 years of service, that employee had never seen Camilla leave her own letters in a hallway, and William had been seen leaving a private meeting with 2 of his legal advisors at 7 in the morning. At 8:15, the memo was circulating through the system. By 9, the palace had understood without being told that something had happened and that it was not going to be undone. What no one in the building had yet discovered was where it all began and who had given William the reason to act. I need to say something about William here because you can't understand what he did without it. This was never about Camilla as a person. It was always about Diana. He was 15 when he walked behind his mother's coffin with the whole world watching. And a boy doesn't come out of it the same person he came in. The calm control, the reluctance to explain yourself, the habit of only moving when you are sure. This all comes from the years he watched an institution decide that his mother's version of events was incorrect, convenient. He learned early what happens inside these walls when the documentation favors one side, and he spent his adult life ensuring that the documentation reached his desk first. Charles had known since the night before. Those closest to him described those hours between a private conversation and the next morning as the most difficult stretch they had seen him go through in years of service. No raised voices, no visible collapse, none of the outward signs people imagine when they hear the word crisis. It was quieter than that. A man had been given something he couldn't ignore, and he sat with it alone all night. He canceled dinner that night, a small thing on the surface, and anyone receiving a short message from his private secretary wouldn't have noticed anything. But people who know his habits will tell him that the evening meal, eaten in private with a single member of staff present, is the only rhythm he protects regardless of what the day has brought him. He canceled that night. The next morning, people around him noticed the quality of his balance, the immobility of a man who has made a decision he can no longer take back and now has to carry it through a whole day of commitments while smiling at strangers. Catherine said nothing publicly, and this surprised no one. She discovered long ago that the most powerful thing a person in her position can offer during turmoil is the absence of anything that can be used against them afterwards. But the people watching her that morning noticed something beyond normal restraint. She was present, attentive, correct in every visible way, and completely unapproachable. The distance she maintained was protection from William, from the children, from the space around a decision that her husband had made. Princess Anne showed up for a scheduled appointment that morning and carried it out without any deviations. Of course she did. Observers noted only that his exchanges with staff were shorter than usual. Her responses were clipped in the way that, with her, signals concern rather than irritation. She spent enough decades inside that institution to read its silences without help. She read this and was silent. The people were the ones who felt the most, as people always feel. 2 members of Camilla's office arrived that morning and were told by a senior administrator that their schedules had been suspended and that they should remain available. No further instructions arrived. They sat in a small anteroom for 2 hours, and neither of them asked the other the question they were both ruminating on, because no one in the building had been authorized to answer. None of them knew yet. Not Charles, with his sleepless composure, not Catherine keeping her careful distance, not Anne with her clipped responses, not the 2 clerks sitting in an anteroom with no agenda and no explanation. The sequence had not started inside the palace. It had begun 6 weeks earlier with a meeting arranged through channels that left no record anywhere between a king and the man his wife had been married to before him. 6 weeks before that memo, a message moved through an intermediary. She avoided the correspondence systems that govern communication between senior royal figures and the people around them. The formal paths that leave records and pass through the eyes of private secretaries trained from week 1 to document everything that crosses a desk. The message traveled through a retired equerry, a man who had given 3 decades to royal service, who knew both domiciles in the way that only long proximity produces, and whose name carries in the relevant circles the weight of a man whom no one ever had reason to distrust. The message was short. Andrew Parker Bowles wanted a private audience with the king. The request itself was not unthinkable. These 2 men are not strangers and never have been. They moved in overlapping worlds for 50 years. Military circles, the social geography of the English countryside. The kind of occasions where people with a complicated shared history end up in the same room. and deal with it with the practiced ease of their generation. They were never close. They were the kind of not close two men get when each has made a private peace with a situation neither chose. This request differed in two aspects: the channel through which it arrived and the condition attached to it. Andrew Parker Bowles specifically asked that the meeting not be recorded. No official calendar entry, no staff in the room, no record of the conversation other than what the two of them chose to carry outside. In a household where almost every interaction involving the king goes through at least one layer of documentation, this condition was strange enough that the equerarius transporting it paused before handing it over, not out of reluctance, but out of awareness that something was passing that, once passed, could not be returned. Charles agreed to the meeting. The few people who heard from her later described her agreement as somewhere between reluctance and inevitability. He had understood, from the form of the request and the identity of the man making it, that whatever Andrew Parker Bowles had carried all these years, he had decided he no longer wanted to carry alone. This understanding produced no resistance in Charles. It produced acceptance that the conversation was coming anyway, and that his only choice was whether to face it head-on or wait for it to find him on someone else's front page. They met on a Wednesday afternoon at a private address in the countryside, with no connection to either of their official lives. A house belonging to the retired horseman himself, offered with the discreet generosity that old networks produce without anyone discussing terms. Andrew Parker Bowles said what he said in that room, and stood between the two of them. Charles people still talk about how he looked when he returned that night. He looked like a man who had been handed an object that he recognized immediately and had been hoping for a long time to never have to hold. Now a note about what comes next. The sequence inside the palace. Charles did not summon her through the usual channels. No messages via private secretary. No entries added to the official calendar. No notes of the kind that turn a private conversation into a record someone can request 3 years later. He sent a message through a single staff member who had not received anything to write, saying he wanted to speak to her that afternoon. Informality was the signal. Within a household where even the most intimate exchanges between two senior family members move through a layer of administrative structure, removing that structure said something that no message could have said more clearly. She was gone within an hour. He had chosen a room they both knew well, a smaller living room on the upper floor of the private residence used for conversations that required distance from the working parts of the home. No table positioned to establish who has the most authority. 2 people and a document on the low table between them, which Charles had placed there before she arrived and had not touched since. Camilla glanced at the document before looking back at him. 1 sheet, a photocopy rather than an original, bearing a date from the period just after her divorce from Andrew Parker Bowles, years before anyone had put the words marriage and Charles in the same sentence. And dates matter for what comes next. Camilla and Andrew Parker Bowles announced the end of their marriage in January 1995. Their divorce was finalized in early 1996. She married Charles in April 2005. That role came from the gap between the two. The decade when no one was watching her, when she had no title, no protection, and no official status of any kind. The contents, which Charles later described to his most senior advisor in the broadest terms he could manage, related to a private financial arrangement she had entered into during that period, an agreement put in writing, and the wording suggested that she had used knowledge gained through her proximity to royal circles, knowledge that she was in no position to hold at that time as leverage within a negotiation that seemed entirely private on the surface. Alone, it carried no legal consequences. No one was going to court over a photocopy from the 1990s. But in the hands of anyone with the context to understand it, that page told a story about judgment, about the distance between what a person does in private and what the public is asked to trust, about what they had been willing to do in the years when no one was watching them. Charles asked him a question, not an accusation delivered with the force of certainty, a question shaped with the care of a man who had spent 6 weeks figuring out exactly how to hold what had been handed to him. He asked her to help him understand how the arrangement had worked. The silence that followed lasted long enough for its length to become a response itself. Then Camilla spoke. She did not deny that the document existed. He didn't question whether it was real. Went straight to reinserting it. The arrangement had been mischaracterized, she said. The context had been lost along the way. What looked like leverage on that page was, in her version, a private negotiation between two people untangling a life shared with each other. Placated, and the knowledge she had used was no more privilege than anything two people acquire from moving through the same environments for 20 years. Charles listened. He didn't interrupt her once. When she finished, he didn't respond to a single word she had said. He asked about Andrew Parker Bowles. Specifically, he asked if she understood why Andrew had chosen to bring this up now, after so many years of choosing not to. This question settled in the room and stayed there, and Camilla, a woman who spent decades learning to work the exact terrain between what is said and what is meant within this family, gave the only answer that told Charles everything that the document itself had left open. She didn't say that what Andrew Parker Bowles had shown her was a lie. She asked why he would do this to her. No one confirmed what Charles decided for the rest of that night, but look what he set in motion over the next 48 hours, because the documentation says more than any statement coming out of that palace ever could. Within 48 hours, the palace's internal financial review office received new instructions. These instructions did not arrive at Camilla's home. They skipped the normal chain of communication that would have given her office any formal notification. They arrived through the king's private secretary, addressed to the guard of the privy purse. The guard of the privy purse directs the money. He has overall responsibility for the sovereign's financial affairs. He signs the household's accounts. And every June his office publishes the annual sovereign grant report, which tells the country how much public funding this family used and on what. For 2025 to 2026, this grant stands at $132.1 million. The man receiving that memo was no ordinary employee. He was the most senior finance employee in the building. The memo requested, in the careful language that institutions use when they want something to appear routine, a comprehensive review of all expenses associated with the Queen Consort's office over the previous 3 years. The Privy Purse Guard had held his position long enough to know that a request of this nature, arriving through that channel, without prior discussion and without explanation, was not routine administration. No one had given him an agenda for the meeting that followed. He showed up, read the memo, and asked 2 questions. The first covered the scope of the review. The second covered who else had been informed. The answer to the second told him everything the memo had left out. William had been included, not notified later, not notified out of courtesy as heir. He had participated in the conversation that produced the memo. His cabinet had been copied in the instructions. His name was on the authorization chain as a participant in directing the process, not as an observer. In 20 years of royal financial administration, the man could not recall any precedent for the Prince of Wales occupying that seat on a matter touching the Queen Consort's domicile. And if you want to understand why William had the legitimacy to sit in that chair, look at 2022. Elizabeth died on September 8th of that year. William became Duke of Cornwall on the same day. The Duchy of Cornwall, the estate that financed the heir for almost 700 years, passed directly to him. This transfer is real and documented, and it is the reason the Prince of Wales is not a man politely waiting in a hallway for his turn. He runs one of the largest private estates in the country with his own legal team, his own financial office, and his own vision for what this family can afford to be seen doing. The legal side was treated with the same care. Senior counsel was brought in to advise rather than investigate. The difference between these two words is huge. An investigation implies a conclusion, waiting at the end. Advice implies a desire to understand the limits of what the institution can do within its own structures. The advice came back accurate. Everything that had been described to the council fell within the sovereign's absolute discretion regarding the management of the royal household's finances. No external bodies needed to be involved. No public process was necessary. The institution could handle everything internally, within. That was the word the lawyers used, and that was the word that mattered. Inside is where this family has buried every difficult thing they've ever had to bury, and William knows this better than anyone alive. He grew up inside. He watched his mother try to speak from within and not go anywhere. He saw the household close ranks around a version of events that served the building, and he left that childhood with a single conviction that never wavered. If the machinery is going to protect someone, he decides who. The machinery had already begun to turn, and William had not yet shown Camilla the full extent of what he had gathered. The changes began quietly, the way serious changes within a royal household always begin. No announcements, no statements through official channels, no press releases, small changes to the ordinary texture of daily life inside the palace, the kind that mean nothing without context and mean everything to people who have spent years learning to read that institution for its details. Camilla's appointment schedule was first. 3 appearances scheduled for the following 2 weeks, a hospital visit, a reception linked to one of her oldest patronages, and a ceremony where she was expected to represent the crown, left the calendar without replacement dates. His office sent the organizations short notes citing scheduling conflicts, and none received an alternative date. The employees who manage your public calendar understood exactly what they were seeing. A scheduling conflict that does not produce rescheduling is not a scheduling conflict. Someone had removed it. 2 members of his office were reassigned. The palace dealt with the efficiency it reserves for personnel changes that it prefers no one to examine. No formal announcement, no acknowledgement in any internal communications that could create a paper trail. Their desks were emptied one weekend, and their access to the building was changed the following Monday. Colleagues inquired and received a response that the 2 individuals had been moved to support roles in other departments, a description vague enough to neither confirm nor deny anything. The official website changed its language about her patronages within the same week. The edits were subtle enough that most readers would pass by them without noticing. Phrases that positioned her as a current presence within each organization were softened to language about her historical association. Present tense replaced by past. In progress exchanged for consolidated. It's the kind of editing a communications team does when someone tells them to create distance and doesn't tell them why. Then came the letter from the Privy Purse Guard. He addressed it to the relevant financial institutions in the formal record of royal administrative correspondence, a record constructed to communicate authority while volunteering nothing. She placed an administrative hold on accounts linked to Camilla's household operations. Not a freeze in any legal sense, a suspension. The distinction existed on paper and nowhere else because the effect was identical. The accounts through which his office paid for staff, travel, and the daily requirements of an active royal household could no longer be operated without additional authorization, and only one office could grant it. William's office. Think about what this means on a practical level because it's easy to hear the word suspension and imagine something abstract. A queen consort's cabinet does not operate out of goodwill. It works through an active account that pays the person who answers your letters, the driver who takes you to a hospital opening, the team who sets up your schedule 6 months in advance, cut authorization, and none of this stops at once. Starts demanding permission. Each order goes to a table belonging to your stepson. She woke up that Thursday as queen, and couldn't authorize her own travels without a man in another building agreeing that she should have them. A meeting still needed to take place, and unlike everything that came before, no one arranged this through intermediaries or managed it through the buffer of institutional protocol. William asked to see her directly, and she did not refuse. She was already in the room when he arrived. Whether she planned it that way or simply arrived early, none of the people in the hallway outside could say for sure, but they could all agree on one detail. William came in and she didn't get up. He stayed in the chair he had chosen, not the one closest to the door, the one next to the window with the afternoon light behind it and the full length of the room between it and wherever he was going to sit. A small arrangement, the kind that says nothing out loud and everything to those who are paying attention. William sat down. He didn't put anything on the table between them. No documents, no files, no visible product of the weeks of work behind that moment. Leaving everything out was a statement in itself. Anything he had come to say didn't need paper to support it. He spoke first. He said he had not asked for that meeting to revisit the evidence or deliver any further consequences or continue an argument that neither of them was formally initiated. He had asked to see her because there was something he needed her to understand, something that no memo and no financial review could accomplish. Then he told him about the silence he remembered from childhood. Not the silence of arguments. He was too young for most of them to register as conflict. What he remembered was the other silence, the private quiet of a woman who had learned over the years that the institution around her would not carry her voice regardless of what she put into it. She had discovered that the protection she was promised came with conditions no one had ever written down, and she carried it alone because there was no place within that world to put it without paying for it. He was not equating the two situations. I said that part clearly, and Camilla, who had been watching him with an expression that revealed almost nothing, revealed something at that moment. A slight shift in the posture of the shoulders, the particular adjustment of a person who prepared for a conversation and realized a moment too late that they were sitting in a different one. He said only that he had observed what silence protected within that institution and what it cost the people it was supposed to protect. And that at some point that he could not name, he had decided that he was no longer willing to extend that silence on the grounds that extending it was easier. Camilla didn't respond right away. When she spoke, she said something that none of the people outside the room will ever hear repeated, because William didn't repeat it and neither did she. Anything that passed between them afterwards remained completely inside. What came out of that room differed from what went into it. None of them called it a resolution, and none of them confused it with heat. A mutual recognition of what had always been true between them, finally said out loud in a space that could support it without requiring anyone to do anything more about it. The door opened 20 minutes after it closed. William left first. Camilla sat by the window for a while longer. Outside, the palace continued with its afternoon in the usual manner. And somewhere beyond those walls, the story had already begun to move toward people who hadn't heard a word of it yet. The first report arrived at 11:43 a.m. on a Thursday, not in a tabloid, not through the kind of anonymous source that produces a breathless paragraph in the middle of a gossip column. It appeared on the financial pages of a leading newspaper. 3 paragraphs. It didn't name anyone. It described, in the contained record that financial journalism uses when it wants to survive a lawyer's reading, an administrative suspension placed on accounts associated with a senior member of the royal household, pending an internal expenditure review authorized at the level of the heir apparent's office. No accusations, no dramatic language anywhere. By 1 p.m., every major outlet in the UK had it. The speed didn't come from the item itself. It came from what every editor in the country understood the item to mean after reading it twice. A financial suspension, a senior domicile, authorization of the heir apparent. The gaps between these sentences were not gaps. They were the story, and it didn't need more source material to become the only thing the British media wanted to discuss that week. The name Andrew Parker Bowles appeared on the internet before it appeared in any formal news reports. Someone joined the dots, a reference in a follow-up item to a private meeting requested through unofficial channels several weeks earlier, and the connection moved through social networks with the speed that information gains when it seems like a discovery. Within 4 hours, his name was the most searched term linked to the story. A man who had spent years on the comfortable fringe of royal coverage, mentioned now and then in historical context and otherwise left alone, woke up at the center of a question the public had decided they wanted answered. Why now, after 30 years of silence? And why he, and how long had he been sitting with this? The palace released a statement through its communications office at 3 in the afternoon. The household does not comment on private financial matters. A phrase in a situation that had already generated several hundred press inquiries. Brevity said what a longer statement could not. Nothing was being offered because nothing that could be offered would improve the position. The service, with a date already scheduled, had been on the calendar for months. A national celebration in one of the city's oldest churches. The kind of occasion that sits at the intersection of the religious and the civic, where the presence of the royal family is not only customary, but constitutionally considered. No one could cancel it if M produced a statement, and no one could attend without producing photographs. Regardless of what had happened within the palace walls in the previous weeks, this appointment was taking place. The cars arrived in separate sequences. The photographers captured this first, because the logistics of royal arrivals on such momentous occasions are never accidental. Someone decides who travels with whom in which vehicle, arriving in what order, and a protocol office has been managing the semiotics of actual movement for generations. The separation was small, and alone produced no obvious image, but people who have covered this family long enough recognized a twist in the situation. Inside the church, the seats did the rest. Charles and Camilla sat in the same row because protocol required it, but the distance between them, a space that would normally close on its own as the row filled, remained open. Nobody filled it out. Whether this came from the seating plan or some quieter negotiation, in the minutes before the service, the result was identical. A space visible in every press gallery photograph, visible in the pool camera footage, and the next morning on the front page of 4 national newspapers with no need for captions. William sat with Catherine several pews away and didn't look back once during the service. He held his attention at the altar with the stillness of a man who has decided that the most powerful thing available to him in such a room is to be present, composed, and inaccessible to whatever is gathering behind him. The image that traveled the furthest was not a confrontation. Nobody confronted anyone. It was a photograph taken during the last anthem, a wide shot capturing the entire royal seating area, the voices rising around them, the occasion performing its ceremonial function flawlessly. And in the center of that image, between 2 pairs of hands resting on work order programs, was the empty space on the bench. No pair of hands reached for him, none turned away from him. They existed on both sides of a gap that the camera recorded with complete neutrality and that the public read with absolute clarity. 50 years into one of the most debated relationships in this country, and it came to 7 inches of empty wood that no one was willing to cross in front of a live camera. Camilla left before the formal recession ended. No one marked the change with any ceremony, which fits perfectly with how this institution always handles its serious internal changes. No announcement, no acknowledgement, a gradual redistribution of small details that builds up over months into a new reality. The absence of a statement was political, not carelessness. She moved to a country residence outside the immediate orbit of the work household. No official communication described the move as anything other than a personal arrangement. The distance it created, geographical and institutional and symbolic at the same time, remained nameless. Someone established it, and then everyone was left to understand it on their own, which they did. Her patronages kept her name on their lists, and the organizations she had supported received no formal notification that anything had changed. But the invitations that used to arrive from the palace, coordinating his appearances at his events, began to arrive less frequently. Then they stopped. Charles carried what he was carrying the way he always carried the hardest things, visible only to people who knew where to look. His public agenda ran without interruption. The engagements, the speeches, the ceremonial functions, all delivered with the consistency he has spent a lifetime training to produce, regardless of what happens underneath. The people around him noticed only one thing: the energy he always brought to private conversation, that quality of genuine curiosity about whoever was in front of him, thinned in the months that followed. It didn't disappear, it became thinner. The difference between a man who is fully present and a man who is present enough. William didn't say anything publicly about any of this, and he didn't need to. The authority he now carries within that institution is not the authority of a man who won an argument. It belongs to a man who was tested against a costly decision and did not move. This type of position is not advertised. There is. The people around adjust, and after enough time, the adjustment becomes the new normal. Andrew Parker Bowles was never publicly connected to any of this. His name was in circulation for a few weeks, carried by public curiosity and the media's need to attach a story to a chain of cause and effect. Then the coverage moved on, and he returned to the comfortable margin where I always saw he saw, present in the historical record, absent from the conversation, having done the thing he decided to do. I keep coming back to the form of it. A woman spent 50 years working her way from the outside of this family to the inside, through a divorce, through 2 decades of Britain's worst press, through a marriage that the establishment had to be convinced to accept. She got the title, got the seat. He got the crown placed on his head at Westminster Abbey in May 2023 with the whole world watching. And Diana's son sat in that abbey and watched it happen and said nothing. He wasn't waiting to create a scene. I was waiting for the paper. She apparently never took one thing into account. The institution she spent 5 decades entering is the same one that taught 15-year-old William, walking behind a coffin, exactly how she treats a woman she has decided is inconvenient. Camilla learned to work that machine from the outside. William inherited it. He owns the duchy. It is in the authorization chain. And he has the one thing she's never had in 50 years of trying, which is the power to decide who the machinery protects. The thing that was left standing when the noise quieted and the palace reestablished the semblance of its ordinary rhythms did not have a clean name. No one in that family would call it a breakup, and no one would call it a resolution. It is the condition a family reaches when something true has finally been said out loud that cannot be taken back. And everyone needs to build what comes next on land that has shifted beneath them. The palace doors never closed on Camilla. They opened less frequently, and then even less frequently. And this turned out to be the most severe version. A woman who spent her entire life fighting to get into that building ends up being the only person inside who has to ask permission from a younger man's office before she can spend a morning being herself. She took the title. He lost what the title was for.